All right. This afternoon, we're here with a good friend, a great friend, actually, of mine, Dr. Dan Engle. And myself and Dan have got to know each other over the last 4 to 5 years. We met at a great community, the Mastermind Talks, that was founded by our friend Jason Gaynord and his wife Candice. And now we're here today to talk about, how to be your best self in a time of crisis. And I'm going to let Dan introduce himself because his biography and his history and his experience in education is phenomenal, and we're lucky to have him on today. So,
Awesome.
Dan, welcome.
Yeah, thanks, Curtis. Good to be with you, man. And good to be able to support your community, because this is such a time when, even with social distancing, it's more important than ever for us to be socially connected. And those things can happen together. We just have the opportunity to do this through virtual platforms now.
Yeah.
So my background has a fair bit to do with crisis. Originally, my background's in psychiatry and neurology. Went through medical school and got trained and board certified in both psych and neuro. Was running a few different integrative psychiatry clinics up until I started my path of more self-discovery work. That was introduced through plant medicine technologies. I lived in the jungle in the Amazon River Basin outside of Peru, this town called Iquitos, for about a year. So started working with really strong transformational consciousness technologies. And then after living at the pace of nature for a year and moving back to the States, it was this abrupt, like albatross crash and burn kind of landing. Because we just, our culture is so fast, it's so intense, it's so competitive, it's so different than how nature works. So I spent a year in a tent in a suicidal depression in the midst of my own crisis, and really started to get into what creates crisis in the mind and how we can work with it, and how oftentimes crisis precedes transformation every time. And so how can we leverage crisis as a springboard for learning and development and growth? And so eventually I came out of the tent, otherwise we wouldn't be having this call, and have really dedicated myself to this conversation, because I firmly believe that when we can shift our perspective around those times of crisis and challenge and like the quote unquote dark nights of the soul, when we can lean into it, when we can engage it from a place of empowerment and participation, then we have just completely changed the game. It's a whole new playing board at that point. So happy to have this conversation with you. It's something I feel very passionate about, and it's timely right now, because we have never in our lifetimes gone through such a global crisis. So hence the conversation.
Well, thank you. And I don't think you did yourself any justice, because I know that there's even more depth to your education experience. But, Dan, on the heels of what you just said, I mean, everybody obviously has been hit in the face with this sudden change and routine change, and, obviously a level of fear and uncertainty. Do you have any thoughts or even recommendations? Because people are trying to find solutions. They're either retreating back or they're reaching out to try and find that solution. And I think it's primarily based on emotion, and based on your experience. You've worked with people that have experienced trauma, a level of crisis, PTSD, and so what are your thoughts around the emotional response to something like this? Because everybody's going to handle it differently, obviously.
Yeah. Well, it's helpful to have a system where you can break down the methodology and the rubric. We in allopathic medicine, trained MDs, we're really good on the battlefield. We're really good at triage care, emergency care, operating room care. We're good at using our hands in the human carpentry arena, orthopedic care, structural care. We're not so good in emotional care or psychological care. Our current, I can say this because I'm psychiatric trained, our current psychiatric model is not a very good crisis preparedness model. We're not really good at knowing how to get to core issues. We're good at creating new novel pharmaceuticals to help people subdue their symptoms while they can figure out the crisis. That's actually the better use of psychiatric pharmaceuticals. But after 6 or 9 months, the brain habituates, they stop working, you need higher doses, people get side effects, they get on other medications, and it becomes this really complicated loop. And many people don't know how to get off the psychiatric medications that they're on. So I like the acronym using your brain, because I'm also neuro trained and I've run neuro repair clinics and I've had 6 concussions myself, and I got deep into the weeds of traumatic brain injury recovery. So I use the acronym use your brain. And I can use the whiteboard to just tell you kind of what that means. So and I got through medical school with acronyms, particularly because I had half a dozen really bad concussions. So my memory at the time wasn't great. So acronyms essentially allow us to embed a lot of information into an easy to remember system. So the B is start with your basics. The R is know your resources. The A is optimize your attitude. The I is investigate the stressor. And the N is navigate accordingly. And so let's break those down and just go through that system. So you start with the basics, which anytime somebody's in crisis, unless their nervous system is centered, they're not going to make good decisions, because we don't make the best decisions from a sympathetic overdriven fight or flight system. It doesn't allow us, I mean, when you just look neuroanatomically, it doesn't even allow blood flow to go into the parts of the brain that are geared for optimal, reasonable, neutral, and best strategy decision making. So starting with the basics oftentimes means start with the breath. Mm-hmm. And the breath is the best way to have a single intervention that shifts the nervous system from stress to relaxation, or at least clear focus. And there's a lot of different breath strategies to do that. But essentially, the more calming, if somebody's stressed out and wigging out because the house is burning down, or crisis, culture, stock market, whatever it might be, is to realize, number one, that you're stressed, and then start with the breath. Mm-hmm. And the breath practice that's the most calming and centering is one where the exhale is twice as long as the inhale. And if you can vibrate the back of your throat, it vibrates the vagus nerve that coordinates your digestive system with your brain and essentially governs the parasympathetic rest and digest part of the nervous system. So if you've ever been in a yoga class, they often talk about ujjayi breathing, right? So it's like Darth Vader breathing, right? It's like the back of your throat gets a little constricted. So it sounds something like, and we all remember, James Earl Jones and Darth Vader. The dude was like the baddest, right? So start with the Darth Vader voice, or even better than that, what I call 4 minutes to freedom is a style of meditation that's been based in pranayama, Vedic medicine that goes back 3,500 years. It's called Brahmari meditation. And what you do is you hum on the exhale. And if you have earplugs or you want to plug your ears, like let's just do that for a minute. Like inhale to a count of 4, exhale to a count of 8. And when you exhale, hum. And do that with your ears closed. And we'll just do 4 cycles, right? So
we're all doing this.
So if you do that, That slows the breath cadence down to about 3 to 4 breath cycles per minute. And if you do that for 4 minutes, you've shifted over from your sympathetic overdrive to your parasympathetic. Rest, digest, organized, clear thinking. I don't necessarily recommend doing that in crowds because people think you're really weird. But if you have earplugs, you can pop on your earplugs or noise canceling headphones or just hum silently. It helps if your ears are plugged though, because it blocks out all the other ambient noise.
Right.
It's called Brahmari meditation. If you do that for 4 minutes, so that's why I call it 4 minutes of freedom, it will help organize your nervous system. That's a helpful thing to do regardless of the stress, or regardless of the mind's perception of the stress. And we'll get into attitude and we'll get into perceptions in just a moment.
So can we take it back maybe before we jump too far ahead? We talk about the nervous system. So obviously we talk about fight or flight. Many of you have probably heard of that statement or that line. Obviously there's a, fight, flight, freeze. We talked with Dr. Doug Brackman. He talked about a little bit about that and, our response to that. But for the viewers that didn't listen to that webinar, let's talk about, when we get in that state, when do we get in that state of fight and flight? Obviously there's a level of fear, there's a level of uncertainty, but our nervous system is there to obviously, provide us with a level of safety or security, or, it's fighting for that.
Yeah. Well, right now, we unfortunately live in a culture that is chronically stressed because we've developed our nervous systems to be on the lookout for predators, for danger. It's evolutionarily advantageous for us to have a fear response. If you don't get freaked out when you're in the jungle and you see the saber-tooth tiger, you're going to be lunch meat. Genes don't get passed on. It doesn't work, right? So it's helpful to have a fear response. But we get fearful about things that oftentimes are either not based in reality, or we don't know if we can trust the information that we're getting. Most of our information that freaks us out is from the media. And right. The media is classically an untrustworthy source of accurate information. Now, if you're walking on the street and there's the back of your neck hairs start standing up and you're like, oh, something's about to go down, that's helpful. Yeah. And then your spidey senses start to look around, is there a threat? Well, what's happening now with this whole COVID thing, a lot of people are negatively impacted. Yes, people are in the hospital, people are dying. And a number of people that are sick and in a critical condition is less than 1% of the total population. And yet the total population right now is being affected by it. Yeah. So we have to understand the perception of the threat and if it's an accurate threat. Once we understand the perception, then we can choose how we want to act. But we have to make sure that the information that we're getting is from a credible source.
Right.
Most of what happens that freaks us out is subconscious anyway. That's why it's helpful to go through a rubric and actually start with the basics and understand the perceptual threat. So at least come back to the breath so that we can perceive whether or not the information that we're getting is actually from a clear source of understandable and viable fear. Like, is there something to be fearful of? If there is, like the house is burning down, hopefully I already have my bug out bag built, right? And it's easier to get out. It's not time to build your bug out bag when the house is burning down. Yeah. Right. So B in this rubric is also not only coming to your breath, but it's also starting with the basics. And the basics is making sure that you have food, clothing, shelter.
Maslow's hierarchy.
Say that again.
Maslow's hierarchy of needs.
Exactly. Yeah. Right. So you start with the foundation, know the exit route, all of that. So when we start with the basics and when we organize our nervous system, then we can better understand number 2, which is, what are my resources? Am I resourced myself right now? Is there anybody in my community that I can turn to that's resourced? And this is where we actually get really understanding of how important it is to have community. Because we're built to bond. We're born to bond more than any other primary need. If you give an infant the choice between food and love, it'll choose love every time. Bonding is the primary need. We are social beings. That's why this whole thing about social distancing and social isolation is actually the worst thing for the immune system. There are clear studies that show that. People in isolation have higher addiction, higher depression, lower immune systems. So right now, there are a lot of people who are freaking out because they're disconnected. Or maybe now it's very clear that they didn't have really tight social bonds or community to rely on in the first place.
Right.
So this is like a trial run of something that could come further down the road. We've known for years that we didn't, at least in the United States, and I think it's pretty similar in Canada, we didn't have the medical infrastructure to deal with a crisis. We've known that for years.
Yeah, I mean,
so,
Bill Gates did a TED Talks in 2015 about it.
Right.
And everybody's talking about that now and praising Bill for what he discussed on the stage. It's true. I mean, the reality is we knew that it was a matter of time, and we didn't have the safety net or the parachute built to actually respond to this appropriately.
Absolutely. And so we have the opportunity to rely on community, and thus you creating community through this platform. Zoom's stock is just exponentially accelerated. They're actually doing really well through this whole thing, and everybody's creating online platforms because we realize that we are social creatures and we need to connect and we need to bond.
Right.
Ideally, we do that from a place of love and cooperation and togetherness and fellowship versus competition and scarcity. Because that's exactly what, if we wanted to go down the never-ending rabbit hole of conspiracy theories, whoever's in charge of this whole grand economic shift, if there is a powers that be that would rather the people not be empowered in the first place, the best way to disempower the people is to disenfranchise the people.
Yeah.
To have them disconnected and isolated and in a state of chronic fear. So thankfully, we have the opportunity to have online platforms and these kind of conversations. We start with the basics, we assess our resources, and then the third part is we optimize our attitude. And that's this part that you were talking about with mindset. And mindset is the key. If we look at I love this quote from Viktor Frankl, Man's Search for Meaning, one of the top books all time. This classic quote in that book essentially summarizes so much of that book, which is the last of the great human freedoms is the ability to choose one's attitude in any given circumstance. And when you know his backstory and you know what that dude went through, that makes what we're going through look like, our stuff is kindergarten compared to that, right? And that dude came out with that ethos, with that clarity of understanding. And he laid that down and he set the bar high. Because just like Jesus said, just like MLK, Gandhi, all the teachers, all these things I do, you can do and more.
Yeah.
Right? So we're all made of the same stuff. And if somebody like Frankl came out of the concentration camp with that ethics, then we all can do it. So it raised the bar to a level of appreciation that we can play victim. We can be, and truth be known, a lot of people are understandably freaked out because their base level Maslow's hierarchy needs are getting shattered. Yeah. There are a lot of people who are destitute on the street, dying on the street, dying in the hospitals, physicians having to make the choice between who dies and who lives. And I mean, there are people considerably in understandable stress. And each time we're presented with a crisis, we still get to ask ourselves the opportunity, ask ourselves the question, how can I participate? Mm-hmm. What is the opportunity for me here? But the only way that we can really ask that question and get clear on the answer is when we've organized and settled our nervous system enough to ask the clear question and wait for the answer. Because every problem has a situation where we can understand the right question to ask. So this whole problem, this whole crisis, like, what's the right question to ask? What's this here to teach me? Who's in charge? Is the information I'm getting credible?
Right.
And once I know I'm getting good information, Then from asking the right question, I can find the right solution. Once I find the right solution, I have the right action. Once I have the right action, then I can create the new habits. And when I create the new habits, then I create the character that is the opportunity for me to be my best self at any point in my life, and including crisis. So in the midst of all of this, it's an opportunity to slow down, be inspired. Right? That's one way to optimize our attitude. Be inspired by people that have been in the shitter, and come out of it.
And it could be a lot worse.
Right.
For both of us.
Right. And have that perspective.
And how resilient we are. How resilient we are. If you look at you talk about the first three basic resources and attitude. How do we prevent how do we shift our mindset and lean into it and attack this versus retreating back? Because that's dangerous, right?
It's an excellent question. This comes back to building our bug out bag before the house is burning down.
Yeah.
We need to be inspired at baseline. Like our baseline level of living needs to be at a level of inspiration that when crisis hits, it doesn't completely dismantle us. It'll knock us off center. Like Mike Tyson, has that great quote. It's like, everybody's got a plan until they get punched in the face. And it's true. Like I can have a plan and then I get punched in the face and then I'm like discombobulated.
I think many of us
come back to my plan.
Yeah.
Right? Ideally, I come back to my plan. I stay inspired. I know going in, like if I have the mindset that crisis is opportunity, if I have that at the baseline, then when crisis hits, I might freak out. I might be sick. I might have my partner leave me. I might have my house burned down. I might lose all my wealth. I might have whatever crisis hits. Come back to center, re-optimize, re-inspire. There's a reason that inspiration means an elevated consciousness as well as it means to bring in breath, right? Breath is life. It is bringing in life force energy. So we ideally are inspired at the core of our being, at the baseline of our life. And then when crisis happens, we're able to access that more readily. Like have a plan for optimizing your attitude before there's a crisis.
Right.
And if people haven't done that, and there have been times when I haven't done that, like I told you when I moved back from the jungle and I was like, holy shit, this culture is not what I'm familiar with anymore. And I lived in a tent for a year. It was like, I was not prepared for that crisis. The crisis that usually happens is at the level of the ego's attachments to what it's going to lose. And if we know that, and we can watch the ego's grasping and fear of losing all of its attachment to health, it's attachment to wealth, it's attachment to validation, it's attachment to being recognized by the people in your community, like whatever the ego wants to attach to. And that's not to make the ego bad or wrong. The ego is just a way for us to navigate the world. But the ego has attachments, and those attachments are what gets threatened in crisis. If we can see the underpinnings of the ego, and then we have more of a distance, then we can respond to the crisis versus react to the crisis.
So on that note, there was comments made in the chat box. Let's talk about the resiliency element. Like how can we bring resiliency into our daily practice versus simply a choice on as we respond? I mean, our good friend Jeff Dallin asked that. Do you have any, and it's great because we're obviously on the third point, which is attitude. How do we optimize that attitude? And I think we talk about how do we prepare for this in the future, even though we're in it right now for many of us. Yeah. But, could you shed any light or perspective on how do we build resiliency and that shift in mindset, whether we're in it or not right now?
Yeah.
Because it doesn't really make a difference, in my opinion. It's all relative. It could get worse. It could get better. So what we do today is ground zero. And that's how we actually, set the stage for the future.
Absolutely. And so you brought up a lot of really good points. One is being in the present, in the now, doing what we can now. Mm-hmm. That always helps us feel stronger because we're engaging a participation of what can happen here in this moment. We don't have to wait for something to happen to regain our power, or we don't have to be handicapped and hijacked from something that happened in the past that's sucking away our power, right? Come current, forgive, let go, get current in the present, relax around the expectation or the need to know about the future, and bring all of our energy here. Once our energy is here, then it's easier to be resilient. And the formulation for, I love the question about resilience. Because at the end of the day, that's this whole hero's journey arc and heroine's journey arc. When we get called into action, and we watch Luke Skywalker and Neo in the Matrix, and Jake Sully in Avatar, and Inanna from the Underworld, all of these epics, Ulysses in Odyssey, like all of the stories that have stood the test of time. You have heroes and heroines that are resilient. And the only way they've gained resilience is to test their mettle, is to be in the what they call in the hero's journey, the trial of challenges, or, you know, get knocked around and grow our ability to be resilient, because that only gets tested through the challenges made into opportunity. And the definition of resilience is the ability to be strong and adaptable in the face of challenge.
Yeah.
And the only way to do that is just like getting into the gym, right? Yeah. If we'd like to talk about resilience in the body, it's about strength, adaptability, flexibility, coordination. Talk about adaptability or resilience in the mind. It means the ability to choose our attitude. Just like Viktor Frankl said, if I want to have resilience in my mind, I get to choose my attitude. I get to choose how I respond. And then I allow the things that are going to strengthen me to be used as resistance training. Mm-hmm. Talk about resilience in the heart, same thing. There's a great quote. That's a Sufi quote by the guy's last name is Khan. Not like Khan from, you know, Star Trek many years ago in the Wrath of Khan, but a different Khan. Anyway, God breaks our heart. God cracks our heart again and again and again until it stays open. And it's such a beautiful, like, if we really rest into the depth of its meaning, mm-hmm. Like, I'm going to have heartbreak. I'm going to have heartbreak. I'm going to have heartbreak, and break it open until it just stays open. And the only way that happens is to get broken open in the first place. Yeah. So we just keep using it as opportunity. So there's resilience on multiple levels. I think of it as 4 levels of the self, or 4 levels of human experience: body, mind, heart, and soul. And we can have resilience on all levels. When we're really talking about resilience at the core of our being, it's resilience at the level of soul. Yeah. And that means to have authentic power, authentic empowerment internally. Because our culture is all based on external empowerment. How many likes I have, what's my net worth, how many cars, like whatever the status quo symbol is of power. And the people that are in the most power in our culture are typically the most hollow and disconnected from a sense of internal empowerment within themselves. So it's really reworking and re-understanding how we actually gain our sense of self-worth, self-validation, that authentic power that doesn't waver internally dependent on what's happening externally.
But internally.
Internally.
Yeah, and you know, you talked about coming back to the basics and breath. I mean, we all started with one breath on this planet, you know, and we own nothing and we were nothing. We were just literally being. And over time, as we, you know, grow, get older, have experiences, we create protective mechanisms. We create emotions attached to events and experiences that create, you know, fear or what we want to be or who we want to become. And it creates expectations. And so, you know, going back to what you said, like the heart, you know, if our heart stayed open from day one, we wouldn't have the issues that we have. We wouldn't have the heartbreak that we have. And so we got to reverse engineer everything that we've, you know, built up over the years. And unfortunately, crisis, you know, cracks that egg sometimes, you know, or trauma or whatever that might be. So going back, so obviously we're on 3 out of the 5.
Yeah.
Basics, resources, attitude.
Yeah. And then once we've done that, right? Once we understand our basics, settled our nervous systems, we know what resources are available to us, we have an optimized attitude. Now it's much more easy and effective for us to investigate the original stressor. Mm-hmm. Like, is this whole COVID thing, is it a real threat? Yeah. Do I actually know anybody that's gotten sick? No. So is it a real threat to me right now? Maybe, maybe not. Is it effective for me to wear a mask? No, it doesn't matter. Oh, sorry. Yeah, actually it does matter. Sorry, 2 months ago we told you when it was first starting that it didn't matter. Now we're saying, oh yeah, masks actually are important. Sorry about that. Which was just like a big fuck up, excuse my French, by the government. And that's potentially why this thing has spread so much. Mm-hmm. We weren't ready. And crisis will reveal our vulnerabilities. It's revealing our vulnerabilities individually. It's revealing our vulnerabilities collectively. In the medical system, in the political system, in the transportation system, like all of that is it's helping us to get current, which is a good thing. When we understand that we need to be really discerning in the information that we receive. Is it the most effective thing to wear masks and disinfect in order to avoid viral contamination? Probably not. There are actually other things that are more important, which is building your internal power, building your internal immunity, first and foremost, before even considering barrier measures. Now, we won't necessarily go into that. That's a long conversation. But there's great data in science to understand that being outside in nature helps, getting good vitamin D in the sunlight helps, eating clean, whole food helps, using targeted supplements that boost the immune system, herbs, vitamin C, the list is deep, those help. Those actually might be even more important than barrier measures in the first place.
Right.
So the fourth stage of that is to be able to investigate the stressor. Take COVID out. I mean, COVID's the perfect enemy here because it's something that we get to actually fight, right? There are still fewer deaths in the United States for COVID than there were suicides last year or DUI driving related deaths last year or homicides last year. Right, but we didn't say those were epidemics.
Right.
We didn't put protective mechanisms and we didn't crash the economy based on those numbers because those things are harder to identify. They're harder to attack. Mm-hmm. It's less clear who the enemy is. But COVID's this perfect enemy. It's like everywhere. You don't know if you're going to have it. Go inside, lock yourself away, put on your hazmat suit.
Yeah.
Don't buy. The not buying shit is actually a helpful thing. That's another part of the conversation too. But the whole part of the investigating the stressors, usually it's really hard for us to know how to investigate it because we have to know where our information is coming from. And most of the information that's populated in the mass media is not accurate.
Right.
Or at least if they're giving you partial truth, it's given through the veil of a agenda. Yeah. It's not unbiased.
Well, and because of that, it's creating confusion or conflicting opinions, right? So you have the extremes. This is going to take over the world. This is going to impact all of us. People are going to die. Lock yourself in your house. Don't go outside. Don't interact. Socially isolate, or let it blow through. It might impact the medical system, but 80% of people are going to get it. And so all this, the variety of information that is out there is causing confusion, which just heightens the hysteria that exists, and it creates chaos. It's just like anything, right? Like, I mean, you look at, when you look in the ocean and water, when there's waterways coming together, it's going to create a little bit of a current or turmoil, and that's what's happening. And so everything gets heightened because of it.
Yeah. Yeah, it's an opportunity for us to reflect on everything that we're taking in, mm-hmm. particularly in the arena of media and information, and then get really clear to the best of our ability. Track the sources for the people that you trust. Ideally, if they're coming from a place of altruism, from a place of neutrality, an unbiased perspective, and if you don't know, then say that you don't know, versus trying to make something up, right? So the investigation part is not an easy answer, especially in something like this, because confusion and fear they perpetuate each other. But ideally, we come back to community and then we share our resources and ask those people in our community, what have you found out? What have you found out? Do you believe that this thing is actually what it is? Most people who I ask if they believe this COVID thing is actually what it is, they're like, yeah, people are dying. This is a real freaking deal. And there's something else happening behind it. There's some other kind of agenda. There's some, whether it's you believe that it's like the force, right? It's on the light side or the dark side. I don't know. But what I do know, that the things that are important to me are staying optimistic, because I do believe crisis precedes transformation every time. So maybe it is that we need to go through this crisis in order to elevate something, learn from something, stay connected to the people that we love, do the personal practices that are helpful for each of us individually, right? It's got the meditation practice that is the most effective is the one that you're going to do and that works for you, right? And exercise and diet and recreation and play and inspiration and all of those things. So we get to come back at least from that place of neutrality and optimized kind of being able to survey the landscape, investigate to the best of our ability. And then the fifth one is navigate accordingly. Once we've gotten all the information, once we have all of our resources, then try and navigate as best you can. And so if we're bringing it back to COVID, just because that's the sexy thing for us to talk about today globally, it's not an easy question to answer for a lot of people, even the navigation piece. Right? I'm pretty healthy, thankfully. Most of the people in my community are pretty healthy, thankfully. And yet there's still this kind of like when we see each other, oh, by the way, I'm not even supposed to tell you that we're seeing each other, right? Because in some communities now I think it was in Washington State and maybe in LA, the mayors and the governor were talking about giving people cash for telling on your neighbors if they weren't obeying the curfew or the like stay at home order.
Right.
That's exactly the opposite of what we want to do. That's not us coming together. That's us spying on each other and creating some continued fear-based separation. So ideally, we continue to stay as optimized as possible, navigate with each other. But even when I see my friends, it's like, maybe we're not supposed to hug. We always hug. Is hugging ever going to be a thing again? Are we going to come out of this post-COVID thing and like actually be okay with handshakes and hugs and like contact? There's a lot of unknowns. Right. So we do as best we can to stay in our power, to stay elevated, to stay inspired, to stay optimistic, to stay resourced, to stay creative, to still find our dance, to still find our play. Right? Like that movie, Life is Beautiful. Yeah. You remember that movie where in the camps, he was still trying to make it a game for his child. And it was just this, it was a testament to the human spirit and what we're capable of. And this is what we have an opportunity to do now, even when we don't know who's in charge of all these decisions, and even if they're making the right decisions. Because a lot of the challenges that people have with your immune systems could be dealt with by starting with the basics: exercise, diet, stress management, sleep, how we do recreate and play. All of those things, there's clear data to show that all of those things elevate the strength of the immune system. And when you do those together, exponentially better. When you look at centenarians, exponentially stronger and more resilient, not necessarily because they're taking like the right supplements, but because they have quality of relationships, they have an optimized lifestyle, they're engaged in their dharma, they laugh. So what can we learn through all of this? It's like a really good opportunity for us to all slow down, get out our notebook and take an honest inventory. What's working in my life? What's not working in my life? And the things that aren't working in my life, what can I do about it? Can I trim out some of the distraction? Can I trim out some of the avoidance? Am I caught in behavioral loops? We could call those addictive cycles because we're all addicted to something. Am I caught in some kind of addicted loop because I've been avoiding something? And what can I do about that? What's working in my life and how do I want to continue to optimize that? Like, however we want to consciously create the better world that we know is possible. There's another book a friend of mine wrote, Charles Eisenstein, called The More Beautiful World Our Hearts Know Is Possible. And he has just this wonderful way of crafting the languaging around the fact that we know we have the ability to choose the vision for our life. And it's only in these like global restriction orders, like you're restricted, go to your room, think about what you've done. Now we get to think about what we've done.
Well, that's, it's incredible, the 5 steps you just talked about. And it's funny when you wrap that up, just this past couple comments, a time like now when our systems are stressed is when we're actually going to see those challenges kind of move to the surface, whether it's deep-rooted issues, emotions, things we're hanging on to, behaviors, items like that. So, the suggestion around journaling and identifying them and take a pause and take a step back and evaluating the things that you want to, clean out from your closet and or work on. I mean, there's no better time because, from my belief, anything under stress, ourselves as human beings, machines as an example, the globe, when it's under stress, you find the weak points. The weak points come to the surface. And a lot of those things are deep rooted. I mean, and that's a lot of the work that you've done, right? Like, how can you introduce a state of not stress, external stress, but a state of getting to a point where you can actually evaluate that. And so I think it's a really good, it's a good tip and perspective that you have to take the time right now and to journal that and really work on something that you might have ignored for such a period of time.
Yeah. Yeah, it's only in the time of crisis that we slow down enough to reorient.
Yeah.
And like actually take the time to investigate, take the honest inventory, and then pick 3 things that you're going to commit to not doing because they're not helpful for you.
Right.
Like, I don't know, pint of ice cream post midnight, probably not helpful.
Yeah.
Distractive, like just stupid 2 hours of internet Facebooking.
Yeah.
I don't know what's not helpful for you, but you will know that.
Yeah.
But you only know that once you slow down and make that list. Like, what do I want to clean up? What do I want to do better? And what am I going to commit to? Yeah. And how am I going to hold myself accountable or find that accountability? This is a great time to do all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. So we're 45 minutes into the hour. Would love the opportunities for the next 10 to 15 minutes to answer any questions. And I know that there has been some, so I welcome the group to put questions in the Q&A area. What was the N in acronym again? That's an easy one that you can navigate, I believe.
Yeah, navigate accordingly. Once you've worked through that entire system, navigate accordingly. Once you have your basics, you know your resources, you've investigated the stressor, now you can choose the best path forward.
Another question that was asked, what changes in society do you think will stick around after the threat is over? It's a large question and a loaded one, I guess, but yeah, would love your opinion on that.
My hope is that we're not going to get sucked into consumerism and distraction like we've been. That we're going to come together understanding what are the virtues and the values that are most important to each of us. What are the rules of engagement? I call them my maxims for living or laws for living. And this is not an exhaustive list. And this is not to say that my list is the best list, but these are the things that make sense for me. Love is our blueprint. Choice is our power. Life is our school. And if I continue to orient my life around whatever the maxims or the laws are for my own life, then I get to co-create the life that I choose to see. Mm-hmm. If I see life as school, then everything's an opportunity for me to learn and grow. If I see choice as my power, then I remember that I can choose how to experience the situation and move forward through it. If I recognize that love is our blueprint, because that's the source of creation. It's where we've come from and where we go back to. We just muck it up in the middle stages in this like one monkey suit because we don't typically have a whole lot of examples in our lives of love being unconditional. But if I know it's my blueprint and where I'm going back to, then I can recreate it because it's already in there. So I get to co-create the new culture, the new society. I get to focus my attention on what's actually happening. That might look like me starting a community garden. Mm-hmm. That might look like me starting a block party just because I don't know my neighbors. That might look like me getting rid of my car and relying on public transportation because I'm recommitted to being a good steward for the planet. Or it might look like a variety of things. Curtis, you mentioned the ocean. When two bodies of water come together, when I think of the ocean, I think of how we've polluted it. I also think of how beautiful it is, but how we've really started to decimate it. And there's some people through this pause that have said, if we just paused a little longer, we would really be able to get to a place of rehabilitating the ocean and rehabilitating the forests and rehabilitating the air quality.
But it's happening.
Like it's happening now.
No, right? they say that LA has never been, smog free and from an environment standpoint, as clean as it has been ever.
Ever.
And,
at least in the last 8 years.
They're seeing dolphins show up in canals that have never existed there.
Right. So my hope is that we keep our eyes on that prize. Mm-hmm. We keep our eyes on the prize of a community and a culture that's cooperative, that's understanding that there's a lot of new opportunities on the landscape because there's close to 8 billion people on the planet. And it's a complicated collective house we all live in together. Oh, by the way, remember, this is all our one home. That when I throw stuff away, it doesn't go away. It just conveniently goes out of my sight for a little while. It makes me feel better about my consumption. Yeah. So I tend to think that it's, like Gandhi said, it's all going to start here first. And it depends on what I'm putting in my mind to what I'm also going to see out there. And what I'm going to allow doesn't mean I have to agree with everything. And I can hold people accountable and still hold them in love. Still recognize that they're a human just trying to do the best they know how to do, given their own ideas and perceptions. So I would turn the question around too, is like, what's the kind of culture that we demand as a people, as a fellowship of humanity? What's the kind of culture that we demand coming out of this? And hopefully we get clear enough on our individual vision that can interlink with a shared vision of what we all want to see happen. Like Margaret Mead said, what was it? Never underestimate a small group of empowered people to change the world because that's all who ever has. Yeah. It's not going to take much. No. But it does require our power. It does require our participation. This is not a spectator sport anymore. It never really has been, but particularly now, it's going to be.
And we're already seeing it, right? We're seeing it in the depth of this crisis, and hopefully, my opinion is that it continues to a certain level, and when you talk about that, it's not only a choice, but we've been forced to band together. We've been, there's a reason to, but it doesn't mean that you need the crisis to do exactly what we're seeing. And sometimes people believe that the world, we needed this in the world, right? Because of everything we've seen over the last 5, 10, 20 years, of how we've been motivated and where human beings have shifted, overall.
Right. I mean, it's true. When you think of if we think of individually and collectively, it's the earth is one living organ system. Yeah. An organism. We just happen to be one part of its living substrate. And our decisions are affecting everybody else, all other species. What happens when we get sick? We get a fever, we lose our appetite, we go inward, we have a reset. That's when things are out of balance internally. Mm-hmm. So it's the way the system is built as a sustainable unit for its own survival. If you take that same analogy and you look at it on a planetary level, the planet is getting more and more toxic because of our choices. Yeah. And so there may need to be a reboot where you go inside, get quiet, have a fever, reflect, come out the other side, ideally more resilient, Hopefully this makes us more resilient and not less. Because like the frog in boiled, the frog in water, if you gradually increase the level of the temperature it's in,
Yeah.
we'll get to boiling without ever jumping out, because it's like, oh, it's a nice day. It's kind of warm in here. And all of a sudden it's dead. Right. Hopefully we don't do that with our civil liberties.
Right.
And what becomes normal on the other side of this, that we still demand that we have freedom over our body, that we're not mandated to have required vaccinations in order to get our driver's license renewed. That's part of the discussion right now.
Mm-hmm.
And if that becomes normalized, then we lose autonomy and sovereignty over our own body temple. Those are the things that we can't just sleep on and take the information from the powers that be, whatever their agenda, as being gospel. Ideally, we create our own gospel. Gospel just means good news. Ideally, we just create our own good news.
Yeah. That's fantastic. I mean, there was a lot of knowledge bombs in this one webinar in the last 52 minutes. So I don't know if there's any other questions. Obviously, it is recorded for everybody that's listening and wants to refer back to it, for everything that you quoted, Dan, for the books that you recommended. But if there are any other questions, please let us know. And if not, I'd love to end it there, because that was phenomenal. Pure gold.
Yeah, happy to, man. It's good to see you again, Curtis. Thanks for allowing me to be a part of your community and just to recognize the community you've brought together.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's
Awesome.
great work.
Well, thank you for everybody listening. And Dr. Dan Engle, he's literally a breath of fresh air. So thank you very much, Dan.
Yeah, always a pleasure, Curtis.